and welcome back. So today we're looking at a parallel design which became quite popular in Britain in the 80s, and it was a design that was very much influenced by floral design from Europe, and it is categorised by very linear parallel placements within the foam. So whereas most of the mass designs we've been looking at in the Back to Basic tutorials are mass designs that all radiate from a centre point, the parallel design was different in that it was arranged from its own placement within the floral foam. So you have 3 or maybe 5 individual groups of plant material, often of the same variety, arranged in clusters rather than massed within the design. And it's often referred to as a modern design or contemporary, although it's been with us since the 80s. So a very popular design, and it's done in a huge range of different styles. And if you look at a European design, it's often a lot more minimalist than the British version. And the British version tends to be a little bit fuller with more plant material at the bottom. So again, if you're researching parallel designs, you will find a whole host of varieties, but basically following the same basic guidelines that we're going to look at today. So if you haven't been before, my name is Sharon, welcome back. This is, I think, the 8th video in the Back to Basics series, and it is very different to what we've looked at before, so a really exciting one to have a look at today. Now I've got a container which I've chosen because it is long and narrow and quite deep to hold my floral foam, and basically underneath my decoration on the outside I have one of these plastic containers. Now it doesn't have to be plastic, it could be ceramic, it could be a basket. It just happens to be that I didn't have a container here today that was the right colour combination. So I've used this plastic container which normally stores my scissors and my knives and that type of thing, and I've decorated the outside with some corrugated cardboard, and it gives me a lovely texture. It also gives me parallel lines, although they are moving horizontally and our flowers are going to be very much vertically, but it gives me some texture and some warmth into the container. But because the base is lined with this plastic base, my foam within the design isn't going to leak out onto my paper or my cardboard surround. So if you don't have the right size container, always consider covering something in maybe some dried leaves, or you could paint it, you could use spray cans. But my option today is corrugated cardboard, which is great because it's recyclable and it's environmentally friendly, so I can reuse it and create something else with it at a later date. And the important factor when you're placing your floral foam into the container is that it is below the level of your container. So if we look at this one, don't have your floral foam above the container because you will have too much foam to cover at the end, and then the centre part of your design becomes very cluttered and very busy. You can, when you progress on a little bit further and you become more competent in this type of style, have horizontal placements that are put in a parallel style as well. But for today, make it easy for yourselves when you're learning. Keep your foam below the container with plenty of space allowed to have these parallel placements working up and down. Okay, so let's have a little look at this and see what flower material we have today. Now, ideally for this style of arranging, it's better to choose materials that are characteristically have that line shape to it. So if I just have a look at some of the foliage, you've seen before me use rosemary, and you've seen me explain to you how that is very much a line material. And you've seen me also look at the Foxtail Fern, so that's one of the asparagus family. So some lovely textural material. And the one thing that you really need to avoid with this type of design is anything that's a spray. So spray chrysanthemums, spray carnations, anything that has those very fussy heads. Try and stick to simple individual flowers with a nice clean stem. Gerbera, carnations, can be roses, irises are fantastic, gladioli are brilliant. But like I say most weeks, it's picking the right material at the beginning will help you achieve the best shape design at the end. Okay, so we're going to start with, this again is birch. Now this birch I've had in ready for the Christmas workshop, so we're heading now into the wreath making sessions, and this has been coated in a cinnamon scented powder, so there's a gorgeous smell that comes from this. Now for me this one is a little bit wide and it's going to spoil the linear shape that I'm trying to achieve. So I'm just going to thin it down so I have a much more elegant shape to that piece of birch. And I'm looking to go about 1.5 times the size of my container, so it's the longest part of my container this time, 1.5 to twice the height. And because we have quite a rounded shape on the end there of the birch, I'm just going to take off a little bit of the outer bark to give me a squarer edge, I suppose, to the base, and it stops it rotating in the foam. And I'm going to work from my left to right. It doesn't matter if you want to start in the middle, but I'm going to start with my first placement. And like the first week where we looked at the line arrangement, this type of parallel style is almost like having 3 of those vertical lines all placed alongside one another with lots of space in between each group. So we've gone straight up, very, very vertical, and I'm almost back on the edge of the container there, so there isn't going to be a great deal of material behind that. It's a front-facing design, so I can bring my flowers then forward in front of the birch line that I've already created. And I'm just going to make that a little bit thicker. So what we're trying to do is to pick very straight material. Now I know I've described this as a parallel line, and you might be looking at this and thinking that the birch branches themselves aren't particularly parallel, but we're allowed to have a little bit of movement within the design. What we don't want to do is to create that shape of very bushy and very heavy plant material. Now when you're beginning, it's often easier to work with flowers and foliage that are a similar colour and a similar or similar shades of a colour. And today I've got lots of very soft peaches and creams which link really well with my container. And another foliage or flower that I've chosen today, this is the Leucodendron, and we often see this in red. Now I've got a little bit of blue status falling in the middle there. We often see this in red and we call it Safari Sunset. This is a different variety and it's a gorgeous shade of green, and another fantastic example of lime. So again, a nice horizontal cut there in the bottom so that it goes into the floral foam. And I'm looking now to create another placement of flowers, a slightly different height to the original placement, and keeping them parallel to one another so that we get those very distinctive lines of material. So when I say parallel, I mean the gap between the stems at the bottom, so this is about an inch gap, is the same from the top to the bottom. And if you think about railway tracks, if you imagine railway tracks on the line or lampposts down a road, this is exactly the same principle. We're trying to keep them so that the space is equidistant from top to bottom, and that gives you that very characteristic parallel style. Now for this one, I'm only going to use 2 of the Leucodendron. We could of course put another one in there, but for me that's going to make it a little bit visually heavy. So we'll just for a minute stick to the 2. And then I have the very lovely Gerbera. And this one is called Cafe au Lait, and you'll see that the darker centre there in the Gerbera picks up really nicely with the colours in my birch there. So I'm going to put these 2 together in one placement. And then I also have a paler Carnation. This is a very, it's sold as a pink, but it's a very soft pink, almost a sort of apricot-y pink. And that's going to form my middle placement in the centre. Now I'm working on 3 groups. You can, if you had a wider container, work with 5 groups or a little bit larger, and probably 3 groups is the minimum really you can do for this type of design. 2 tends to look a bit uneven and a little bit unbalanced, and it can be done in a much smaller container, and you will see another video where I've done parallel placements, just using 2 sections. But if you've got a nice long container like I've chosen, you will be able to get away with using 3 clear placements of flowers. So we've gone in the centre, slightly taller than this group but slightly shorter than this group here. It doesn't matter which way those groups are formed, whether the taller group is in the middle and the shorter groups are on the edge. You just really need to look at the material you've got and see where it looks best positioned within the design. Okay, so I'm starting with the smaller head on the bottom, on the top. So same sort of rules as flower arranging. We're going smaller at the top, working our way down towards the centre. And what I'm trying now to achieve is to keep those stems equally spaced apart. And we'll place 3 in, and then we'll spin it around for you to have a little look at. So this centre section, if you look back and you refer back to that very first video, this centre section is almost the same as that line design that we did at the beginning. And we're trying to achieve a fairly equal space between those flowers. And if we look at it from the side, everything is very much straight up with your flower facing the ceiling. We're not doing what we do in traditional arranging and bring that towards the front to give us a profile and a shape from the side. We're very, very regimented in our placements, quite straight and very vertical. And I've got 5 of these, and these are going to work their way down to the base, bringing that colour all the way through to the bottom, hoping to keep those stems equally spaced apart. And that's my main 3 placements in the position. Now, European styles of parallels will often have a much bigger gap in the middle. And the bigger gaps where there's no plant material, that's what we refer to as negative space. So they have a lot more negative space within their designs. If you look at an American style version of this, they tend to do them almost like flowers grown in the garden, where they have a sort of series of one flower across the back. It might be a gladioli, then they have a series in front of that, which might be aleatrus for argument's sake, but they have their parallel lines with no spacing in between. So different countries have adopted different versions and different styles of this simple arrangement. And I always think this looks fantastic at either Christmas, where you can have candles in one of the sections in one of those vertical placements, or it looks fantastic at autumn, where you can use fruits and berries. Brilliant at harvest, where you can have wheat and grasses. And some of your placements could even be vegetables, so you could have carrots, or leeks are fantastic. A bunch of asparagus together there in a pile gives you a really interesting texture. So if you're looking maybe to do flowers in the church at autumn, or an arrangement that depicts an interpretive theme using fruit and vegetable, this is a really good design to use. Okay, so let's add a little bit of foliage in now. So we have some of the rosemary, and for me the colouring of the rosemary goes very well with the colour of that carnation there. And again, I'm very much straight and vertical with the placements. Now, you of course don't have to put any foliage in at this stage at all. You could have left the carnations together on their own, but for today's video I thought we would introduce foliage as well, because British flower arranging and floristry tends to have some really good examples of foliage. So that's the foliage in there, and it tends to give it a little bit more depth as well. And again, if I turn it round and look at it from the back, you'll see that I'm very, very straight at the back. We haven't needed to bring any weight through to the back to give us some actual balance or some depth in the arrangement. And of course it's front facing, so it's only seen from one side. Okay, so what else have we got here? I've got a small little bit of the Foxtail Fern, and I'm going to use this with my birch because the birch is almost see-through and just a little bit of foliage there, almost like two Christmas trees standing out in the field. And I've got one smaller little bit, so I'm going to bring the other one through onto the opposite side. Just tucked a little bit down low. It helps to bring the texture and the colour through onto the opposite side as well. Now you could, if you wanted at this stage, just fill in your base and not worry too much about any more flower material. You've still got those three very obvious vertical parallel placements. But I've of course got the lovely Gerbera. And I've got 5 of these. I might not use all 5, but we'll see how it works. Now nice and tall. Now the Gerbera is a very soft stem flower, so what I've done there is I've cut it at a blunt end rather than that 45-degree angle. It gives you more surface area there when you put it into the foam. If you cut it at that angle, it's a little bit softer to go into the foam. And what I'm trying to achieve there with the Gerbera is to have the Gerbera on a different height to the Carnation and a different height to the Leucodendron, sorry. Otherwise you end up with a very, very severe line across the top. We need to have lots of different movement so that your eye graduates to the top of the design as it moves up through the arrangement. So we could possibly move this down a little bit further so that we've got nice interesting shapes. And with the Gerbera, if you have the option, you would start with a smaller flower on the top, but often with this style of arranging, the Gerberas you will find are pretty much the same size of head. Now the Gerbera is much bigger, it's a much more dominant flower than the Carnation. Particularly being that it has that dot in the centre, so it's a lot more visually heavy. And I think if I put 5 in there, it's going to make this side of the design very, very heavy, very visually very heavy. We'll have too much colour on this side and not enough over here. So what I can do is to bring over the Gerbera onto the opposite side, because it then helps me bring the colour through. And if we look at the Gerbera, you will see again they're very straight, they're very vertical, and I've tried to keep the gaps between them as equally spaced out as I possibly can. And then to join on the opposite side, I'm going to put 2 Gerbera. Now, those of you that are traditional flower arrangers, you might be thinking, oh, you can't use 2 in floral design. Well, in this style of arranging, this more European style, you can indeed use 2s. And again, what I need to do is to bring that Gerbera across so that it's in a different placement to all the other flowers I've got there. And this one was quite a bigger head than the first Gerbera I put in, so this one is going to come down quite low in my foam. Tucked almost down so he's sitting on top of the container. And that there, I think, is pretty much my floral design finished before I cover the base section and before I put some materials on the floral foam. Now at this stage, if you had raised your floral foam up any higher and you were trying to cover your floral foam, you would end up with a really cluttered section here on the top. So this is why I've maintained that very low placement within the arrangement, and I've kept the foam very low. So this one is Dianthus Green Trick. It's one of the carnations. It's part of the Sweet William family, and this gives me a lovely link in texture with the very fluffiness of the fern. But what I'm going to do with this is sit it very, very low down on the base of the foam so that it acts as a covering for my foam that doesn't clutter that lower section. So if I just, oh, I've got a right itchy nose, if I just tilt that forward slightly, you'll be able to see that from the top it's covering the floral foam, but if we look at it from the top, it's still giving me a nice clean negative space there in the centre. Okay, so now I have something that's a garden plant material. This is called Heuchera, and it has a lovely bronze tone to it. And again, it picks up really well on the centre of my Gerbera and on the birch twigs there at the back. And these are going to sit flat in this section here towards the front. Now in this style of arranging, we don't have one focal point. In my case, I have three. I have three in each placement of those vertical those vertical lines. I think I had another leaf. Yes, I do. I'm just going to move this one. It's a little bit big for the front. I'm going to take it more towards the back. And what I'm doing with this section is I'm almost layering them on top of one another. So a technique is layering or stepping, where you have the materials placed on top of one another. And this will work really well as ground coverage, so it'll help to cover my foam, but those flat leaves don't overfill and overcomplicate that centre section. Okay, so let's have a look at how the colour is working there. I think that's working well together. Now what I'm going to do now, because if I look down on it from this position, I can still see some floral foam visible at the base. So what I'm going to do here is just use some moss, so your ordinary moss. This is just your sphagnum moss that you would maybe make Christmas wreaths with or hanging baskets in the summer. You could use a decorative moss like reindeer moss, but again, this was a lovely colour link with the container. Now this side I can see a little bit of blue of the container, so if I just sit that on top, this will give me a lovely texture, great coverage of my floral foam, but because it's not a fussy material like a very heavy leaf, it won't overcomplicate that centre section. Now you could of course put some cones or some stones here at the base, and I often equate this to the base of your forest. So the bottom part of the design, if you're out walking, anything that you find on the floor, so stones, broken bits of bark, some lichen covered branches maybe, some dried leaves, those types of materials are brilliant here for down at the base. There we are, so a couple more there in the centre. And I think we're pretty much done there on finishing that design. Okay, so if we have a little look back at it, we have these three individually arranged vertical placements of flowers and foliage in a parallel style. This section and the middle section and the end section is what we call positive space, because there are flowers in the space, and then these gaps in between, which are often not easily understood when you're learning flower arrangement, because you do want to fill in all the space within the arrangement, because when we're doing mass designs, mass traditional designs, we are told to create a shape and then fill it in so all the space is covered. So when you move on to this type of arranging, to leave gaps in the flowers is sometimes quite hard to do. But this section in the middle, where we have no flowers at all, is called negative space, and it's one of our principles and elements of design. So I hope you've enjoyed that one, a little bit different to what we've looked at before. Fantastic design that you can really play around with depending on the various seasons. It's great with spring arrangement. It's fantastic if you just have 3 individual placements of daffodils, some pussy willow maybe, or some irises. And it's great, as I said, in the autumn, where you can use cones and berries and dried leaves at the base to create a lot of textural interest. So I hope you've enjoyed that one, and I hope you've been enjoying the Back to Basics series. If you are interested in following any more videos, then please like the channel. give us a thumbs up or consider subscribing so that you have a notification of when we post more videos. And hopefully we'll be back next week with something else exciting for you to look at. So bye for now, and we'll see you all very soon.